Hey, what up Seekers? Welcome back. This week we're going to be exploring the life, the legend, and the legacy of the Renaissance mystery, Giordano Bruno. Giordano Bruno was a man who mastered the art of memory, and yet the memory he left behind is shrouded and wrapped in layers of mystery. There is little consensus on who Giordano Bruno was. The Catholic Church saw him as an impenitent, pertinacious, and obstinate heretic. In the 17th century, he was a kindred spirit amongst libertines, Rosicrucians, and other unorthodox thinkers. To the German philosophers of the 18th and 19th century, Goethe, Jacobi, Schelling, Hegel, and the English Coleridge, he was a pantheist, an idealist, an Enlightenment hero, a predecessor. In the 19th century, science historians saw him as an early proponent of atomic theory and modern cosmology. In 19th century Italy, he was raised as a hero to the anti-clerical revolutionary Risorgimento movement, as a humanist, as a symbol of rebellion and the freedom of thought, along with the 19th century Italian scholars catching Bruno mania, as his intrigue became de rigueur among cultured Italian intellectuals. The Theosophists in the 19th century saw him as one of their own, with their founding women claiming to be his reincarnation. In the 1960s, the historians Francis Yates and D.P. Walker painted him as a Hermeticist magician and mystic, situating him squarely among the alchemists, Gnostics, Neoplatonists, occultists, and religious reformers of the Renaissance. In 1991, John Bosse even proposed that he was a spy engaged in espionage for the Queen of England. In 1997, Karen Sylvia de Leon-Jones argued a fringe position that he was a believing and practicing Kabbalist. In 1999, Hilary Gatti, a historian of science, made the case that he was a scientist. In 2002, Farinella and Preston deduced that he was in fact a mathematician. Ingrid Rowland, in 2008, following the lead of Giovanni Acquilezia, presented Bruno the Philosopher, with a nuanced eye to the internal interplay between philosophy, theology, and poetry in his writings. And most recently, in 2014, to the eyes of millions of viewers, Neil deGrasse Tyson, in collaboration with Seth MacFarlane and National Geographic, animated Bruno as a scrawny astronomer and cosmologist. So, a heretic, a theologian, a spy, a pantheist, a scientist, a revolutionary, freethinker, humanist, rationalist, philosopher, mathematician, poet, magician, and occultist, Kabbalist, Hermeticist. Who was this guy? Bruno has been called a pioneer who roused Europe from its long intellectual sleep, one of the most adventurous thinkers of the Renaissance, the patron saint of every Italian who hates the Catholic Church, one of the most evil men that the earth has ever bore, a symbol of stubborn defiance in a society better known for its conformity, one of the great figures of early modern Europe, and one of the least understood, a precursor of modern civilization, a man of infinite knowledge, brave and brilliant, the outstanding philosopher of the Renaissance, one of the mighty, one of those strange, incomprehensible pioneer geniuses who lived centuries before their time. History has not yet registered a stable appraisal for Giordano Bruno, wrote Giorgio di Santillana. Let us together explore that instability. One thing that everyone can agree on is that Bruno was killed by the Catholic Church, martyred for his beliefs. Immortalized in bronze, his statue in Campi di Fiori, the Field of Flowers, a square in the center of Rome. The square where he was burnt alive still stands as a testimony to his cruel death, after having spent the better half of a decade languishing in an Inquisition prison cell, subject to severe interrogation, most probably torture. A man who so loved the fields, the woods, the streams, imprisoned underground, with hardly any food, no books, and no writing material, itself a form of torture for a man of that nature. The Freemason Ettore Ferrari sculpted the monument to Bruno, which was erected in 1889 through the efforts of a group of Roman students, soon after the unification of Italy and its establishment as a secular republic, overthrowing the papal rule of Rome. A gesture that so infuriated the Vatican that in the late 1920s it lobbied Mussolini for its removal. Mussolini declined. For the students of a new Italy and a newly independent Rome, the statue is meant to prove that ideas can and must prevail over the attempts by authority to stifle them, writes Roland. At the base of the statue is inscribed the words, "To Bruno, from the generation he foresaw, here where the fire burnt." Echoing the words of Bruno, "Take comfort, the time will come when all people will see as I do. But the question of why Bruno was killed, and for which of his beliefs he was martyred, yields no further consensus. 4 centuries after he went up in flames, it is still not clear why. A question which scholars have devoted years and 300-page books to try answering, and still remains a mystery. One of the reasons for the difficulty in answering this question is because of the lack of documents from Bruno's extensive trial by the Venetian and then Roman Inquisition. Here is the mysterious story of the missing documents, one of the most high-profile execution cover-ups in the history of the Catholic Church. For close to 300 years, there was no documentary confirmation of the killing of Bruno by the Church, and the Church denied it. Bill Kunz writes, "For centuries, rumor and doubt shrouded the terrible fire in Campo di Fiore, and as late as 1885, there are references to the legends of Bruno's burning at the stake. While Bruno mania was sweeping Italy in the 19th century, Catholic apologists rose to the Church's defense, denying that Bruno had been executed. It was only in the 1860s, thanks to the work of Domenico Berti, that historical documentation proving the savage fact was found. But how, asks Berti, is it possible that a burning that took place in a public square in the middle of the day with a large crowd of onlookers was not mentioned in any local chronicles, nor any trace of the savage fact, as he calls it, in the letters that his important friends exchanged in the hours and days following the event? Was the terroristic power of the Inquisition such to leave speechless the thousands and thousands of Catholics gathered in that year in Rome for the Jubilee of 1600? Asks Berti. In what reads like a real-life Dan Brown mystery novel of murder and cover-ups at the highest levels of power, Berti, in 1868, recounts his hunting for and the finding of the documents. Let me give you the short version. So, just to get the timeline straight, Bruno's trial for heresy by the Roman Inquisition began in 1593. 6 years later, on the 14th of January, 1599, the Vatican approved a list of 8 heretical propositions from Bruno's writings. On the 20th of January, 1600, after years of trial, imprisonment, and torture, Bruno was declared a heretic. All along, the proceedings were being carefully documented and recorded. This was no back alley hitch-up. This was the Catholic Church's Inquisition. Everything was written down. 12 years later, the Vatican Secret Archive was formed, the place where the documentation of Bruno's trial would eventually end up. But this documentation was kept secret, and its existence was denied to anyone outside the Catholic Church for over 250 years. Fast forward to Italy in the 1840s and 50s, where the newly formed Roman Republic was taking shape. The thought leaders, the brains behind the new Republic, were in dire search for Bruno's documents as much as they were in search for the values with which they could unite Italy, both to cultivate their own internal identity and to make clear who their enemy was. In a desperate attempt, the short-lived Republic of 1849, that lasted all of 146 days, sent Giacomo Manzoni, their finance minister, to search the Vatican secret archives for these papers. He found there information and documentation pertaining to Bruno, but nothing that shed light on the trial and verdict itself. 2 decades later, following the proclamation of the unification of Italy in 1861, in papal defeat, the documents were published for the first time by the then Minister of Education Domenico Berti in 1868, bringing an end to 250 years of silence. But all that was published was documentation confirming the execution of Bruno, itself important, but nothing of the actual trial proceedings or the actual accounts of heresy that he was charged for. So, the story continues. At the close of the 19th century, Pope Leo XIII, struggling to restore the papacy's tattered reputation, took the bold initiative of opening the Vatican archives to researchers, but not wanting discussion of Bruno to destroy what he was trying to mend, he skirted the documentation of Bruno's trial aside, along with some other incendiary documents, into his personal private archive. Then, in 1969, something rather shocking about the documents came to light. Something that had happened in the 1800s. So, it turns out that besides for kidnapping a pope, Napoleon also raided the Vatican archives in 1810, taking back over 3,000 cases of documents with him to France. And on their way back to the Vatican in 1816, many of the documents were considered useless and were destroyed and sold as waste paper or were simply lost in transit. As was published in the 1969 volume of the Carte Segreti journal, Mario Martini, charged by the Pope Pius VII, with bringing those treasures, the looted documents, back to Rome, did not doubt in considering the trials of the Holy Office useless. and did not hesitate to break them into tiny pieces, immersing them afterwards in water to macerate them, and sold them to a Parisian cardboard factory, receiving 4,300 francs, a large sum indicating how much paper was sold. Also, by the way, a convenient story for the Vatican, I'm sure. Oh, you're looking for that file about a guy that you think we killed? Yeah, it must have been one of those documents that were stolen by Napoleon. We're so sorry we can't confirm that murder for you. But even if the trial proceedings against Bruno were lost, and let's be honest, who knows if they actually were, word started spreading that one document still existed, which was the summary of the trial against Giordano Bruno, a thematic index of Bruno's final judgment in Rome. And sure enough, after 15 years of searching for it, Cardinal Angelo Mersati, a prefect of the Vatican Library, found the summary document on the 15th of November 1940, and 2 years later it was published for the public with an accompanying introduction. It would take a while to find the document, considering that the archives have 53 miles or 85 kilometers of shelving, brimming with 16 million pages worth of documentation dating back well over 1,000 years. With a catalogue system so hopelessly inadequate, it alone bestowed the name secret upon the archive. Why did the Vatican publish the summary after all those years of keeping it secret? It's a good question, and it's one we're not sure the answer to. It's another mystery along the list, and unfortunately, part of the researcher Bruno has a lot of unsolved mysteries which we're just going to have to accept or try find answers to. But unfortunately, even this precious document, the summary of the trial, didn't give us a full list of the heresies Bruno was accused of, never mind the record of his 16 interrogations. So the question, as Roland asks, still stands. The church made Bruno a martyr, but a martyr for what? Historians, professional and amateur alike, continue to argue passionately about what it was exactly that constituted Bruno's heresy. While during the 18th and 19th centuries, Bruno was painted as a proto-scientist and proto-Enlightenment philosopher, who was put to death by the church for his cosmological opinions about the infinite size of the universe, his insistence on the belief in other planets, possibly even populated ones, and the non-centrality of planet Earth, making him known almost singularly as a martyr for science and free inquiry. Most historians are of the opinion today that Bruno was mainly found to be a heretic for his religious beliefs and not his scientific ones, that he was burnt for his theology and not his cosmology. The narrative of Bruno as a religious heretic and not a martyr for science is conveniently adopted by the various Catholic encyclopedias, looking to downplay the narrative of the Church's suppression of free thought and science. They would rather us believe that Bruno was killed purely for his theological stances against the Catholic Church, specifically his doubting of the doctrine of the Trinity and the personhood of God, his mocking of the divinity of Jesus and the virginity of Mary, his questioning of the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, and his belief that all of creation would ultimately be reconciled and forgiven by God, including the devil himself. And that's a denial of just about every core tenet of Christianity, definitely enough to get one killed back in the 1500s. And in good humor, in responses to his charges of heresy, Bruno maintained that he still had an object of awe and cause of great wonder. In the words of an accuser, he marvels at how many heresies God tolerates amongst the Catholics. But it's not just the Catholics. Historians likewise argue for this position quite vociferously. They argue that Bruno could not have been charged on account of supporting and furthering scientific models of the universe, particularly that of Copernicus, with the sun, not Earth, at its center, because they say that at the time that Bruno was burnt, Copernicus's heliocentricity, his belief that the sun was the middle of the universe, was not even a heresy. Thus, both the Catholic encyclopedias and the historian Yates concur respectively that Bruno was not condemned for his defense of the Copernican system of astronomy, nor for his doctrine of the plurality of inhabited worlds. That's the Catholic Encyclopedia. And the legend that Bruno was persecuted as a philosophical thinker was burnt for his daring views on innumerable worlds or on the movement of the earth can no longer stand. Yates. However, just to keep things from getting too simple here, a minority but vocal opinion argues that the Romantics who saw Bruno as a martyr for science and freedom of thought were actually onto something. Just now the case can be made with good research and not just wishful thinking. And just in case you thought I was kidding about how vociferous this debate has become, Hilary Gatti, in her rebuttal to Yates, writes, Yeats failed to understand the sense of Bruno's trial. The few pages dedicated to it in her book are among the least satisfactory and the most confused. And instead, Gatti proposes that the real issue at stake, excuse the pun, was about free thought and the right of the philosopher to pursue an inquiry touching on the same subjects as those considered by the theologian. And more on the scientific side, in a case made more recently by Alberto Martinez argued that Bruno was indeed put to death for his scientific cosmological views, specifically his belief in the infinity of the cosmos, in the decentrality of planet Earth, in the centerlessness of the universe, in the belief that the sun was just another star and that every star we saw was a sun of its own with its own orbiting planets with their own potential for life and habitation. Remarkably in line, by the way, with our modern cosmological models of the universe. Far more than Copernicus, who still hung on to much of the Ptolemaic scheme, believing that the universe was spherical, with the sun unmoving at its center, with the planets moving on concentric spheres around it, and that the stars were mere motionless, unorbited luminaries twinkling on a sphere in the sky. But truth be told, this dichotomy between theology and cosmology, religion and science, was probably entirely foreign to Bruno himself. It's actually quite clear from his thought that there was no split between Bruno the proto-scientist and Bruno the philosopher, Bruno the theologian, and Bruno the poet. In his writings, they seamlessly blend into one intricate, infinite cacophony, a mix of ecstasy, argumentation, abstraction, and deduction, a disjointed unity, while grasping for the infinitely large and the infinitesimally small. In good mystical fashion, Bruno, the rambunctious philosopher of the infinite, presents us with a holistic vision, with no part separate from one another. Exactly as he envisioned reality itself, did his work reflect a unified, messy, beautiful whole. This mirror image between the expression of Bruno's thinking and the ontological reality as he conceived it is a beautiful achievement which we shall touch on later on in the video. For all of you that were here for the last part of the series, for our video on John Scotus Erigena, you can now appreciate this theme of a parallel or demonstrative expression of thought and reality, epistemology and ontology, and just wait till we get to Hegel to see that taken to a whole new level. Back to our subject at hand. We see in Bruno the seamless blending of all human thought, so defining of that Renaissance moment, in his heroic blending of genre and methodology. Example number one is his immense ontological treatise titled On the Immense, which is written largely in epic verse. He's speculating here alongside Lucretius, Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, and Einstein, but he does so in the form of a poem. Try submitting something like that today to a contemporary scientific journal. And this to many is what is so remarkable and terrifying about Bruno. As much as he had to say about science and the nature of the natural universe, and as much as his pronouncements proved right, even if it took us a few hundred more years to confirm them with observation and mathematics. By his methodology alone, by his way of deducing his propositions, Bruno was no scientist. And this is not a knock on Bruno. This is incredible. Bruno reached his conclusions about the universe, its infinity and relativity, through abstract contemplation alone. Unlike Galileo, Bruno did not have the gift for complex calculation or meticulous empirical observation. But in almost every case, he went further than Copernicus and Galileo, without telescopes and without mathematics, getting there via other modes of observation, via philosophy, and via his own mystical experiences, wherein he experienced the infinite united expanses of reality, and learned something true about the nature of the universe, which had to wait for Newton and Einstein to do the hard work of proving empirically. Bruno was a mystic and a visionary, who substituted geometry with poetry and trigonometry with non-Trinitarian theology. And he had reached a level of certainty and confidence in his conclusions that he was willing to stake his life on it, and he did. More foolhardiness perhaps, or courage, than one may have were they staking their lives on pure mathematical equations or even on empirical observations. If this is sounding like some anti-science rhetoric, you've misunderstood me. Let it be said for the record that we here at Seekers of Unity are very pro the scientific method. We're simply trying to highlight that exquisite, ill-understood part of human thinking that we call intuition, hunch, the sense that we know something to be true before the work has been done to prove it so. The magic where most, if not all, good science and good human thinking in general must begin. And if the slow, methodological, rational, or empirical work is done and shows our intuitions to be false, we roundly and swiftly throw them in the trash where all disproven hunches should go. Bruno's intuition, luckily, happens to have been astonishingly correct, and hundreds of years before its time. What was Bruno's philosophico-poetico-scientific conviction that gave him enough courage to stare down the Vatican, the Pope, Catholic Church, and half of Europe, all the way until his very last moments, the strength to turn his face away from the crucifix held up to his lips while the flames licked his toes? It seems that there was one belief in which he so deeply knew to be true, that every bone in his body confirmed, from which flowed his death-defying conviction and his most daring scientific pronouncements, and for which he was happy to be one against millions, and to have his ashes thrown by the millions into the Tiber. The odds, although 1,000,000 to 1, were in his favour, because he experienced what he knew. He experienced the universe firsthand, seen it with his own 2 eyes, and felt it in the depths of his own soul. Bruno writes, "And while I venture out beyond this tiny globe, into reaches past the bounds of starry night, I leave behind what others strain to see afar." Bruno believed this, that God was infinite. Calling God the One in good Neoplatonic footsteps of Plotinus, Bruno writes, "The One infinite is perfect, in simplicity of itself absolutely, nor can anything be greater or better. This is the whole, God, universal nature, occupying all space, of whom naught but infinity can give the perfect image or semblance." Of whom naught but infinity can give the perfect image or semblance means that the universe must be as magnificent, glorious, and infinite as the God it is actively manifesting. The universe was no longer the backyard of a 15th century God. Bruno tried to imagine a God whose majesty would dignify the majesty of the stars, and a universe that in turn would be a dignified manifestation of the majesty of his God. Here we hear it in Bruno's unfortunately all too typical fighting words, dripping with mockery. "Make then your forecasts, my lords, astrologers, by means of those astrolabes with which you seek to discern the fantastic 9 moving spheres. In these you finally imprison your own minds, so that you appear to me but as parrots in a cage, turning and hopping within those circles. We know that the supreme ruler, i.e. God, cannot have a seat so narrow, so miserable a throne, so trivial, so scanty a court, so small and feeble a representation, that can be brought to birth with an apparition, shattered with a dream, restored with a delusion, diminished by a calamity, abolished by a misdeed, and renewed again with a thought, such that with one puff of air it were brimming, and with a single gulp it were emptied. On the contrary, we recognize a noble image, a marvelous conception, a supreme figure, an exalted shadow, an infinite representation of the represented infinity, a spectacle worthy of the excellence and supremacy of him who transcendeth understanding, comprehension, or grasp. Thus is the excellence of God magnified and the greatness of his kingdom made manifest. He is glorified not in one, but in countless suns, not in a single earth, a single world, but 1,000,000, I say, in an infinity of worlds." To Bruno, God was an infinite God, represented in a majestic infinite universe, an object of awe, veneration, and aesthetic delight, not some fallen, sinful, rotten snow globe to escape on our way to heaven. In Bruno's mind, an omnipotent God created innumerable worlds. The universe for Bruno, just as his conception of his God who created it, was infinite and united. It was alive with the life of God. It, like God, was fecund and eternal, exhibiting all possibilities at each given moment, thereby constituting a visible manifestation of the timeless and absolute invisible principle, God, the sole being who truly exists. As we've hoped to demonstrate, it was a direct result of Bruno's expansive, magnificent, and revolutionary vision of God, that he was compelled to a like vision of an expansive, magnificent, and revolutionary universe like our own. But this new vision did not jive well with the Christianity of his day. For Bruno, the infinity, unity, and interconnectedness of all things meant that the divine was within each human and within each atom, so that any notion of original sin or of a fearful God judging us unworthy was out of the question, dismissed as mere fear tactics and power plays to control the masses. Bruno likewise had no patience for the Christian notion of hell, foreign as it was to his God and universe bound and stitched by love. And he rarely spoke of heaven, of the abode of bliss and angels somewhere beyond the clouds, preferring to speak of the heaven on earth that we can experience here and now if we so choose to live a life of harmony through our contemplation of the infinite unity that is. This was serious stuff for the church. The dismantling of heaven and hell undermined a critical method whereby social conformity was maintained. Without a strong carrot and stick incentive and deterrent, what was to keep people from eating each other alive in the street? But this all might have been child's play in comparison to what may have been Bruno's most dangerous thought. One of the implications of Bruno's doctrine of the infinity of the universe was that the universe could have no center. By definition, no point in the cosmos could hold center stage in a universe of infinite expanse. If that thought doesn't make you cold and shiver, then you may not be fathoming its full implications. Bruno flicked the world off its privileged position as the center stage of the cosmos, precisely situated along the great chain of being, the arena which, according to Christianity, God had orchestrated to play out his all-important human drama of creation, sin, and redemption. Bruno completely abandoned this center stage scheme for something terrifyingly insignificant. Bruno preached that our planet is adrift in the deafening silence of the cosmos, so chillingly large, stripping us of any warranted sense of significance in the cosmic scheme, lost in an infinite empty space, in an absurd and meaningless void, where you can scream and shout and cry and yell and pray and beg, and no one will hear you yell. How's that for scary? Yet for Bruno, this wasn't a crippling and terrifying thought. It was invigorating and empowering. He writes, "And even as infinite space is around us, so is infinite potentiality, capacity, reception, and malleability." Central to Bruno's vision was the belief that a universe whose center is nowhere is a universe whose center is everywhere. And this is precisely what makes him a precursor to the modern period. He embodies the modern sensibility, the acceptance of the meaninglessness of existence as a given. And from that givenness emerges the drive to create something meaningful. Some may argue that the Catholic Church was genuinely justified in sticking a skewer through Bruno's tongue and torching him, effectively stopping him from completing his formulation of his new philosophy, which from their perspective could potentially throw billions of humans into a state of existential terror, nihilism, and absurdity in a vast infinite universe where they play no pivotal role. Maybe the noble lie of the world as God's center stage was a profitable lie, one worth maintaining at all costs. Maybe the murder of Bruno was justified because of how much pain and suffering his ideas would have caused were he left to bring them to fruition. Allow yourself to entertain this thought for but a moment. Bruno was an existential terrorist, and the church did the right thing for the sake of the ignorant masses, to shield them from the existential terror he would have rained upon them. Maybe the terrifying truth ought to be kept at arm's length from the millions who wake up, work, eat, excrete, and sleep peacefully, not knowing their real place in the universe, or lack thereof. Maybe the Jewish community was right to put Spinoza in Cherem, in excommunication, Islam for hanging al-Hallaj, and Athens for poisoning Socrates. Maybe free thinking just isn't so wise after all. And the Catholic Church seems to think so, until this very day with the case of Bruno. In 1942, Cardinal Giovanni Mersati said publicly that the Church was perfectly justified in condemning Bruno. And in the year 2000, on the 400th anniversary of Bruno's death, Cardinal Paul Popard made the Catholic position on Bruno clear by saying that neither can they nor should they consider rehabilitating his legacy and memory, because Bruno's thinking was, quote, incompatible with Christian thought. But, he said, the Church ought to regret burning Bruno because, quote, the use of coercion and of violent methods is absolutely incompatible with a sincere and authentic search for truth. Good morning, America. And at the same time, Cardinal Angelo Sodano, the Vatican Secretary of State, declared Bruno's death to be a sad episode, but despite his regret, he defended Bruno's prosecutors, maintaining that the Inquisition had the desire to support freedom and promote the common good. and did everything possible to save Bruno's life. That is, of course, everything besides for not tying him naked to a wooden stake and throwing a match into the combustible materials piled beneath him. Everything else but that. Cardinal Sodano asks that we judge the inquisitors who sentenced Bruno to his gruesome death in the light of their gruesome times, saying, "It is not our place to express judgments about the conscience of those who were involved in this matter." In the same year, Pope John Paul II made a general apology for the use of violence that some have committed in the service of truth, with no direct reference, remorse, or apology for the burning of Bruno. And just in case the Catholic Church's position on the death of Bruno isn't already abundantly clear, you'll be displeased to know that in 1930, the Church bestowed the esteemed honor of canonization and beatification upon Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, the inquisitor who prosecuted, investigated, interrogated, and judged Bruno's trial, the man likely most responsible for Bruno's execution, venerating him officially as a blessed saint and doctor of the Church to over 1 billion Catholics worldwide, one of only 36 individuals to receive this esteemed honor in over 2,000 years of Christian history, resulting in numerous Catholic churches, universities, colleges, and private schools, kindergartens, and high schools around the world being named after him. Someone should really start a change.org petition to get this guy uncanonized, if that's a thing. So, was the Church justified in the 1600s, and right to persist in its judgment all the way up until the year 2000? We here, perhaps unsurprisingly, say no. To quote an authority whom the Catholic Church ostensibly stands by, we must say with that Jew, who himself was raised on a wooden stake by the authorities some millennia and a half before Bruno for speaking his truth, a resounding no to the question posed. Because we believe, as he did, that the truth shall set you free. Echoed later in the words of Bruno, the heroic soul shall seek truth and find it. And it is for this reason, perhaps, that the Serbian poet Didan Stojanovic poignantly wrote, "Burning Bruno was one more wound inflicted on the body of Jesus." Back to the discussion that preceded. There are a couple of other reasons given as to why Bruno was really killed. I'll tell you about them before moving on to what we think is the real story here. Some say that the last straw in Bruno's coffin was his refusal to accept the authority of the Inquisition itself, something which must have filled his inquisitors with glee. Bruno repeatedly insisted during his trial that he would gladly recant all of his heresies if the Pope himself would personally preside on the trial, and declare Bruno's beliefs heretical. It seemed that it was Bruno's real hope that the Pope stepped down from his throne to the dais so that Bruno could demonstrate for once and for all that his beliefs were in fact not heretical, and in doing so, hopefully convert the Pope over to his way of thinking, his new philosophy, and along with the Pope, all of Christendom. At the very least, no one can deny that Bruno was ridiculously ambitious. But trying to convert the Pope, as anyone who's been following the channel closely, or is just a student of the history of Messianic mysticism, knows that it typically does not end very well. Extra points for anyone who writes down in the comments the names of some others who had tried this unsuccessfully. And in our case here, Bruno's request to go over the heads of the inquisitors, particularly the esteemed and now canonized, beatified, and venerated Cardinal Bellarmine, did not bode well with their egos, and may have just been the thing that sealed the deal on Bruno's execution. Others suggest, on similar lines, that it may not have been anything in specific that Bruno taught, but his cantankerous, impetuous, irascible, and quarrelsome attitude, which in fact had got him kicked out of every city and university he had stepped foot in, and which eventually got him locked in an attic by a student he was tutoring in the art of memory, while the student called the Venetian Inquisition to come over and arrest him. Not for naught has Bruno been called capricious, insufferable, foul-mouthed, tempestuous, insolent, self-asserted, pompous, and arrogant. Not the side of his personality or legacy that we're most proud of, but neither are we here to whitewash history for you. And it was not for his good looks that Bruno owns the distinction of being the only 16th century philosopher known to have been excommunicated from all three major Christian confessions of his day by the Roman Catholics in Naples in 1573, by the Calvinists in Geneva 3 years later, and the Lutherans in Helmstedt a decade following. So we've opened up two main questions here. One, who was Bruno? And two, why was he killed? And we've explored some of the classic well-known answers given. We spoke about how the church tried to cover up his death, all the while venerating the people who signed off on it. But there are two more mysteries which really bug me here about the story. Firstly, Bruno's return to Italy is a real mystery, a real puzzle that continues to baffle historians. To paint the puzzle for you, Bruno was born in a small city called Nola, a little east of Naples, in 1548. At the age of 17, he went to study in Naples with the Dominicans. After a few years of study, he came under suspicions of heresy by his superiors, and an investigation was launched against him, causing him to shed his religious attire and flee north, effectively expelled by the Dominicans, and began 15 years of wandering, writing, and teaching, producing some 30 works in total, while traveling north first to Turin, Venice, and Padua, and finally leaving Italy for Geneva, Lyon, Toulouse, Paris, London, Oxford, back to Paris, Wittenberg, Prague, Helmstedt, and Frankfurt. Never staying more than 2 or 3 years in any city, his usual pattern, to quote Dale de Banksy, was to enter a city, find a way to display his intellectual talents for the academic elite, and then parlay that display into a teaching position or a private tutorship that would last the 2 or 3 years it took him to inevitably clash with the academic establishment, write some inflamed philosophical dialogues that belittled them in a manner more reminiscent of a rap battle than an academic paper, and flee to greener pastures just a step ahead of the lynch mob. For example, in one of the philosophical dialogues he published while living in London, after being denied the opportunity of lecturing in Oxford, he writes a scathing attack on the Oxford professors, decrying their ignorance and pomposity, saying that they had more interest and knowledge in beer than they had in the ancient Greeks, the people who they were supposed to be studying and teaching. Then, in 1591, Bruno, maybe weary from a decade and a half of traveling, opens his final chapter by deciding inexplicably to return to his country of birth, Italy, first to Padua and then to Venice. This return to Italy is truly baffling. Let's understand, Bruno had fled his homeland, Italy, because of what was essentially religious persecution, a lack of freedom of thought and expression, to the more liberal and partly Protestant countries of the north. Why did Bruno return to Italy, to what he knew was a hotbed of religious fanaticism? Why did he step willingly back into the clutches of the Inquisition, who already had a thick file on him from his rebellious days as a youth, which continued suddenly to grow and thicken, thanks to his continued antagonism and rabble-rousing while up further north in the continent? Was he homesick? Had he become overconfident, out of touch with reality? Some historians say that he came back because at the time the Inquisition seemed to be losing some of its steam, and the Republic of Venice, to which Bruno returned, was at the time the most liberal state in Italy, that things perhaps had cooled down a little. Whether this was true in general seems besides the point for Bruno, because within a year of his return he had been arrested and incarcerated by the Inquisition. Before taking a stab at giving our own answer to this puzzle, I'd like to let you in on one more puzzle, because hopefully our solution will answer both of them. The next puzzle is, why didn't Bruno recant his position? The Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly the Vatican Secret Archive, discussing the trial against Bruno states, in the same room where Giordano Bruno was questioned, for the same important reasons of the relationship between science and faith. 16 years later, Cardinal Bellarmine, who then contested Bruno's heretical doctrines, summoned Galileo Galilei, who also faced a famous inquisitorial trial, which, luckily for him, ended in simple abjuration. Namely, Galileo, in the very same room, by the very same inquisitor with the very same accusations leveled against him, caved in, he renunciated, repudiated, and recanted his heretical beliefs. Was Bruno no smarter than Galileo? Was he too brave, too stubborn for his own good? It seems that there is something larger here at play. And here is where the big picture begins to unfold. Up until now, we've only given you the historical facts, as we've best understood them. Hereforth, we're going to continue giving you the facts, but they'll be mixed with our own conjecture as to what's going on here. Okay, so with that caveat out of the way, here's one thing that I haven't yet told you explicitly about Bruno, although I've been dropping hints to it throughout the video. Bruno was a master of memory. While still a student in Naples, in his late teens or early 20s, Bruno's reputation as a memory savant was so impressive that he was shipped off to Rome to show his mnemonic system, his memory wheel that he had designed based on the fascinating 13th century mystic polymath and master of memory himself, Raymond Lull, in front of Pope Pius V, reciting Psalm 86 by heart, in Hebrew, word for word, forwards, and then backwards. We, in 2021, may not appreciate the advantage that a wicked memory like that held for someone in society back then, without external memory cards on smartphones and laptops, with all of humanity's collective information available at the tips of our fingers. And even just the accessibility of information in printed books. Are you guys old enough to remember what printed books are? Back in the 1500s, if you wanted to be a successful lawyer, cleric, administrator, bureaucrat, or monarch, you had to find a way to boost your capacity for recall, the alternative being to rely on clunky archives with underqualified librarians. You wouldn't even be worth hiring as a lawyer unless you could recite hours of case law from memory. And a ruler who had dozens of disparate but interdependent items brought to their attention every day for governance really needed a way to hold all of that information and more in clear vision and recall. This is where our man Bruno steps in. Like the proliferation of today's self-help guides and gurus and diet fads, people skilled in the art of memory, the ars memoriae as it was known in Latin, who were willing to dispense with their hard-earned secrets and train novice rememberers, were in high demand. Bruno made most of his bread by going around and teaching his memory system to whomever would pay for it. The gig, in fact, that eventually led to his arrest, with a disgruntled memory student, as we've mentioned, if you remember from earlier. I don't plan on getting too deep into Bruno's memory system right now, but just to give you a quick taste of it. According to Frances Yates, in her memorable and influential The Art of Memory, Bruno's memory system was primarily a zodiac-based variation of the combinatory concentric revolving circle method of Raymond Lull, where relevant bits of information were stored and based by subject upon a wheel that the practitioner would envision, with each segment of the wheel opening onto larger circles where more relevant information would be stored. According to Yates' enduring interpretation, the goal of Bruno's memory system was to furnish the mind of the practitioner with an encyclopedic orbit of mental representations of all of the world's knowledge, thus connecting the appropriately trained mind with the totality of reality beyond the mere world of appearances of the senses, and through that real mental connection, created between the real world and the mind which is in possession of the ideas, the forms, which constitute the real world, one is able via the power of their mind to effect change in that world, whose ramifications will by extension ripple into the external world as we see it. As Yates puts it to us in the form of a question, did Bruno intend that there would be formed in the memory using these ever-changing combinations of astral images some kind of alchemy of the imagination, a philosopher's stone in the psyche, through which every possible arrangement and combination of objects in the lower world, plants, animals, stones, would be perceived and remembered, and that, in accordance with the forming and reforming of the inventor's images on the central wheel, the whole history of mankind would be remembered from above, as it were, all their discoveries, thoughts, philosophies, productions. Such a memory would be the memory of a divine human. This prospect of reaching beyond the phenomena to the real numinous reality, the source code of our universe, and being able to tamper with the code, whether they be Hebrew letters, the Sphirot, energy from the zodiacs, and effect change in the world as we know it, was of enduring fascination to the Kabbalists, Hermeticists, Gnostics, and other esotericists and occultists of the middle and early modern ages, a fascination which continues, albeit attenuated, with the birth of modern science, switching out Hebrew letters for ones and zeros, Sphirot for AC, Gs and Ts, atoms and quarks, in an attempt to gain mastery over the code of nature, to the point where one can manipulate it by will. We can make a separate video on Bruno's memory system, and on the art of memory in general, with their memory palaces, theaters, and wheels, although you'll have to remind me. Killer dad jokes. What seems to us initially no more than a fancy party trick, which Bruno perfected as a means of a livelihood, became in fact the doorway to his philosophical system, one that would synthesize a century's worth of confusion and progress into a united, albeit still slightly confused, whole. Bruno's memory system revolved around the construction of elaborate wheels of association that brought mathematics, language, mythology, and philosophy all together in one interrelated whole before it was prematurely terminated by the executioner's flames. If anything is clear right now, it is that Bruno was obsessed with memory, He was one of the few people to go down in history, that is the collective human memory, as one who mastered the art of memory. And here is our hypothesis. Bruno, the master of memory, returned back to Rome, back to Italy, to play his final memory game in front of the Pope and history itself. Fearing a future loss of memory, fearing that his thoughts would blur into oblivion, Bruno took a gamble with his life, a gamble against the church, one against a million. Ironically, according to this interpretation, Bruno went to Rome twice to display a feat of memory before the Pope, the first time as a friend, and the second as a foe, initially celebrated and ultimately vilified. Like Socrates, who chose not to flee Athens, and Jesus to Jerusalem, Bruno returns back to Italy, to the Inquisition-infested Italy, gets arrested while teaching the secrets of memory, ironically, and does not recant his teachings, because he knew that that is where he would get his final stage. This theory sits well, by the way, with the little that we do know of Bruno's trial. Firstly, a point that we mentioned earlier, that much to the chagrin of his inquisitors, Bruno repeatedly tried invoking the authority of the Pope, asking that Clement VIII come himself to preside on the trial. As we speculated earlier, this may well have been an attempt, delusional or sane, by Bruno to have the audience and ear of the Pope, so that he could convince him and convert him to his new philosophy. And secondly, we have the appraisal of Berti, of Bruno's self-defense during the Venetian phase of the trial, in which he was lucid and articulate. Berti notes he is not interrupted, and he argues with much calm. More than defending himself, he seems to be concerned with making his doctrines known, for this reason quoting his books constantly. Had he ever recounted, repented, and retracted his words, they would have been lost to the sands of times. He prefers to lay out his philosophy as clearly and calmly as he could, die a gruesome death, and let his ideas live on. And with every burning of the flame, Bruno's message was further seared and branded into the collective human memory, into the pages of history, for me and you today. Bruno, then it seems, had returned from the north to Venice, not tired and defeated, but awake and alive, his passion simmering and beginning to bubble over. On the way from his prison cell to one of the final inquisitorial interrogations, Bruno told a fellow inmate that he was going to perform, quote, miracles greater than those performed by Jesus. Most think that Bruno was just blowing hot air, or that he actually thought that he was a hermetic magus with real magical powers. I happen to think neither. I happen to think that Bruno was actually dead serious here. Bruno's miracle, however, was not walking on water, levitating, turning water into wine, or multiplying bread out of thin air. Those for Bruno were simply party tricks. Miracles, according to Bruno's philosophy, could not really occur, because he took the Spinozistic view, pre-Spinoza of course, that since divine law equally rules all events and all happenings, whatever happens, happens in accordance with divine law or nature. But nonetheless, disclaimers aside, Bruno's miracle, his object of wonder, was his philosophy. As the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy puts it, Bruno's philosophy of God as immanent in an infinite universe was the true bread of life. It illuminated the blind, loosened the tongue of the dumb, cured the lame, so that the human spirit could once again progress. Its powers were miraculous, Christ-like, salvific. In Bruno's maybe somewhat inflated, granted self-estimation, who deserved more praise? Someone who healed a random cripple, or a man who liberated his homeland, who reformed not merely a body, but a mind? In other words, who was the true savior, Christ or Bruno? Stanford Encyclopedia's words, by the way, not mine. Let us talk then for a moment about Bruno's miracle then, his philosophy. If enough people request it, we can make a separate video dedicated to Bruno's philosophy, particularly his theory of substance, form and matter, the infinite and the monad, and his unique version of pantheism and monism. But for now, let us suffice with a short recap. Roland, in response to the 1889 inscription at the base of Bruno's statue, to Bruno from the generation he foresaw, here where the fire burnt, writes, despite the optimism of the Roman students who erected his monument in Campo di Fiori, in many respects the generation he foresaw still belongs to the future. Bruno defies any kind of summary judgment. His life, his ideas, and his personality are as complex as his times are distant from our own. Despite Roland's warning, I'd like to proceed to attempt a few short words about Bruno's philosophy, about the miracle that Bruno brought. Firstly, there's divided opinion on whether we can call Bruno's work philosophy at all. While the Danish philosopher Harold Hoffing calls Bruno's work the greatest philosophical thought structure executed by the Renaissance, the English Bertrand Russell takes a swing at Bruno's work, saying, "There are fruitful intuitions lost in that disorder, but they had not yet reached the point of precision at which philosophy begins." We'll have to excuse Russell for his Englishness and his concomitant narrow definitions of philosophy. We're going to go with the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as the final word on this debate. Bruno's philosophy, despite its inconsistent terminology, intricacies, eclecticisms, and willful contrariness, has an inner coherence. Indeed, he can claim to be the first thinker since antiquity to integrate metaphysics, physics, psychology, and ethics into an original, if unsystematically presented philosophy. The outcome was a radical alternative to medieval and Renaissance interpretations of human nature, the cosmos, and God. And it is precisely Bruno's radical notion of the infinite, which he takes as the starting point and the end goal is his philosophy, which gives an internal coherent incoherence to all of his metaphysics, cosmology, ethics, ontology, logic, and science, as Bill Kunz observes. I want to present not the specifics of his philosophy, but its general context, its wellsprings that it draws from, and its hope and aspirations of what it plants. Firstly, you should know that Bruno's self-expressed aim was to articulate a new philosophy. In a series of Latin poems written in 1591, he calls for a new logic and a new metaphysics, a radically new system of knowledge to accommodate his vision of the cosmos, a vision later called the acentric labyrinth. And during his trials, Bruno made it abundantly clear that if he was freed, he intended to return to Germany or England and continue to spread his teachings and recruit followers to set up a new sect under the banner of his new philosophy. No surprise that his conservative Catholic jailers were in no rush to release him. Bruno's philosophy, while based on ancient and medieval sources, represents a radical rupture with the philosophical schools of the past, attempting to forge a path towards a new modernity, in the words of Gatti. One of the things that most interests me, and you'll hopefully find interesting as well in Bruno's thought, is Bruno's perennialism. Following in the philosophical footsteps of the Renaissance perennialists that give the movement its real shape, Marcello Ficino, Giovanni Pico-dell'Orangela, and Agostino Stucco, who gives the philosophy its Latin name, Philosophia Perennis, who incidentally died the same year that Bruno was born, 1548. Bruno's perennialism continues an alleged ancient philosophy, an ongoing wisdom tradition, as the name suggests, purported to have originated from a caste of teachers whose very existence blurs the line between history and legend. The Persian Zoroaster, Egyptian Hermes Trismegistus, the Hebrew Moses and Jeremiah, Greek Orpheus, Pythagoras, Parmenides, Empedocles, and others, who passed the tradition, according to the perennialists, onto Plato and Plotinus. And Bruno, with his encyclopedic knowledge and dazzling memory, sought as best he could to restore, unite, and synthesize over 1,000 years of philosophy. The Egyptian Hermeticists, the Persian Magi, the Hebrew prophets, the Orphic poets, the pre-Socratic metaphysicians, Pythagorean mystical mathematicians, Platonic, Stoic, and Epicurean philosophers, all united with one purpose in the mind of Giordano Bruno: to articulate a philosophy which was true to the principles of ancient wisdom, as it was to the best scientific knowledge of his day, as it was true to the deepest of his own experiences and convictions, those that resonated with the very core of his being. To quote Dale de Bexy, for Bruno it was not Catholicism nor even Christianity that had a monopoly on the truth, but rather everyone from Egyptian priests to skeptical Greeks that made their critical contributions, all plugging into the unity of the universe in their own unique way. The unique gift and miracle that Bruno gave the world was his combination of ancient philosophy with contemporary philosophy, a rational mysticism which envisioned the universe as an infinite organism teeming with divine life, a beautiful and diverse philosophy for a beautiful and diverse universe, one which had room for the peaceful coexistence of all religions, as diverse as the sources he drew from, based on a mutual understanding and the freedom of deep reciprocal conversation between them, all pointing to an infinite God, a God who for Bruno was more accessible in the depths of nature and in the depths of our own individual hearts and minds than in the hallowed words of authority and power. In the admiring words of philosopher Thomas Davidson, which in our humble estimation go a little over the top in their enthusiasm and estimation, but are worth repeating for their passion nonetheless. Bruno was one of the mighty, one of those strange, incomprehensible pioneer geniuses that lived centuries before their time, destined apparently to lay out the tasks for many succeeding ages. He rose not only above the dogmas and superstitions of half-obsolete medieval Catholicism, but with equal ease and firmness above the new follies of growing Protestantism. He belongs not to the 16th century, but to the 19th, and even to the elite of it. Great in philosophy, great in science, physical and moral, he was still greater in practice, in life and in death. No man ever labored or suffered more in order to be free himself and help others to be so. No one ever met death more firmly and heroically. Among the martyrs for truth and freedom, those first essentials of mankind, he occupies the highest place. In the year 2000, 400 years after Bruno's burning, an Italian newspaper conducted a survey in Campo di Fiore, underneath the shadow of Bruno, asking people if they knew who he was. Sandro Corsetti, who grew up near the square, told the newspaper, "I just know that Bruno was a serious thing, so serious that they burnt him." Like any good teacher, Bruno knew what the people would remember. And then they would ask, so why was he burnt? A question which would lead to some confusion, and then hopefully, maybe just maybe, a peek into, if not an exposition of his ideas and philosophy, to his thought and his mind. In the very act of me making this video, and you watching it right now, and perhaps sharing it, Bruno's gamble further plays off. You and I right now and right here are further vindicating Bruno, continuing his fight for freedom of thought and freedom of speech. Viva la Bruno. The church tried to silence Bruno and to suppress his memory. 3 times, in fact. First by killing him, then by suppressing the records of his execution, then by destroying or hiding their own documentation outlining the details of his trial. They silenced him and silenced his death. They expunged any reference to him, murdered him and eradicated his memory, wiping him clean off the face of the earth. Or, at least they tried to. Perhaps most gruesomely and representationally, however, of this attempted silencing, Bruno on his way to his execution was literally silenced with a gag in his mouth, or a metal spike skewering his tongue, so that he could not yell his truth from between the flames, even with his dying breath. The church did all this because they were afraid to hear what he might say, what final poem he might utter, what new philosophy he might complete, and what new human and new world it might just give birth to. They were afraid of the poem that would unite the wisdom of the past, Hermes, Zoroaster, Moses, Plato, the Chaldeans, and Jesus, with the thought of his day, philosophy and religion and science. Lucretius, Democritus, Cusa, Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler, into one cohesive, compelling philosophy and poem. That the church could not risk, and they did not give him the chance to finish his work. But his spirit drifts on, his poem continues, into and through the pens of Spinoza, Leibniz, and Newton, Hegel, Schelling, and Fichte, Coleridge, Swinburne, Wordsworth, and Goethe, Emerson and Thoreau, you and I, to add one last verse to the poem the world is waiting to hear. Bruno was arrested by the Venetian Inquisition on the 22nd of May, 1592. On the 12th of September that year, the Vatican requested extradition of Bruno from Venice to Rome, which was acquiesced to in January, 4 months later. Bruno spent the next 7 years languishing in a prison in Rome. While the Inquisition dragged on their investigation and interrogation, historians are still baffled as to why it took them so long. Bruno, the man on fire with a poetic vision of an infinite universe, was kept in a teeny dark dungeon for 7 years before being taken out to a blazing fireplace and roasted to death by fire. One fellow inmate and later accuser in Bruno's trial testified that in prison one night Bruno brought him to the window and showed him a star, saying that it was a world and that all the stars were their own worlds. On the 21st of December, 1599, Bruno was offered his last official opportunity to recant, to which he responded he should not and would not recant. He had nothing to recant and had written nothing worthy of recanting. A month later, on the 20th of January, 1600, the Inquisition in Rome, under the auspices of Pope Clement VIII, formally declared Bruno a heretic. On the same day, the Inquisition issued the order that all of Bruno's works be placed on the Index of Prohibited Books, and that he be handed over to the secular authorities of Rome for execution. They didn't want to bloody their hands with actually killing him. 19 days later, on the 8th of February, Bruno's sentence is read. He's declared an impenitent, obstinate, and pertinacious heretic, stripped of his priesthood and expelled from the church, and his works publicly burnt on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. Upon hearing his sentence read, Bruno is said to have replied, "Perhaps it is you who pronounce my sentence, that are in greater fear than I who receive it." Bruno's execution was delayed. We still don't know why. But 9 days later, on the dawn of the 17th, Bruno was taken to Campi di Fiori, looking emaciated and broken. Even in his last moments, the church does not give him peace to contemplate his short life and its early ending. A group of monks accompany him, urging him to the last moments to abandon his radical beliefs, seeking to extract a last-minute confession and repentance from the lips of Bruno. The 52-year-old Bruno is stripped naked and tied to a rough wooden stake. Before the fire is lit, a monk offers him a crucifix to kiss. Bruno turns his head away defiantly. The fire is kindled and Bruno is burnt alive, while a choir of cantors accompany the crackling of fire and the sizzling of flesh and skin with continuous hymns. The flames that rose round living limbs and fell, in lifeless ash and ember, now no more. Bruno, a man who had committed no other crime than to talk, write, and argue, was killed on February 17th, 1600, Rome, and his ashes scattered into the Tiber River. But Bruno might have disagreed with our pronouncement of his dying. The man who preferred a courageous death to a meek life, and the man who intended to rend with might the clouds, and be content to die, if God such a glorious death for us did intend, also wrote, "When we consider the being and substance of the universe in which we are immutably set, we soon discover that neither we ourselves nor any substance doth suffer death, for nothing is in fact diminished in its substance, but all things wandering through infinite space merely undergo a change of aspect, namely a superficial change, a mere change in appearance, while the substance stays the same." I'd like to end our words on Bruno, before moving on to one last thing, with a quote from Bill Kunz, who sums up the story quite nicely. In 1584, 25 years before Galileo lifted a telescope, Bruno took the Copernican hypothesis to the outrageous new conclusion that the sun is merely one of an infinity of stars, which stretch across boundless and inexhaustible space. It was consummate audacity to proclaim an infinite universe in the teeth of the doctrinal dogfights of the 16th century. It was yet bolder to exult in the De Imensio with the bounding wonder of a poet. The prospect of our earth reduced to a turning speck in endless space was terrifying to contemplate. An ecstatic Bruno cried, "My thoughts are stitched to the stars," and contemplated little else. With an impetuous abandon that his contemporaries found reckless and even dangerous, Bruno proceeded to rethink man's relationship to the universe, to himself, and to God by the unimaginable light of countless stars. His conclusions were simply unbelievable for a late medieval mind. Infinite other worlds, inhabited like our own, spread throughout space, a structure to the universe of suns and clusters of suns, circling in grand orbits, but no center except the ground beneath 2 human feet. The presence of God not atop an Empyrean throne, past the threshold of the further stars, but inhabiting every atom of matter. An eternal span to matter, which can change its form but never be exhausted in any proportion, and finally, a logic infinity demanded of him. An innate union of all contraries by which evil and good, history and the future, localized humanity and an infinite universe inform and express one another. His restless mind not only explored but transformed the heavens. In this lonely Italian vagabond, great ages pivot, and the center of gravity of all human thought tilts. 47 years earlier, on the first day of the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, September 9th, 1553. After 9 days of scouring the country and confiscating every copy of the Talmud they could find, the repository of 1,000 years of Jewish law, legend, humor, wisdom, and wit. The Talmud, just understand, is not a book. It's a miniature library consisting of 36 tracts, collectively over 5,400 pages, and close to 2 million words in length. After 9 days of collecting, horse-drawn wagon loads of Talmuds were piled together and burnt in Campi di Fiori, in the very same square where Bruno was burnt just 47 years later. History demonstrates again that in a place where books are burnt, it won't be long before people are burnt there too. For books, as the American poet Amy Lowell taught, are more than books. They are the life, the very heart and core of ages past, the reason why men lived and worked and died, the essence and quintessence of their lives. In 2011, 458 years after the burning of the Talmud, a plaque was set in Campi di Fiori commemorating the incident, and in celebration of the completion of the translation of Adin Steinsaltz's translation of the Talmud into Italian. As you can see here, the witness to the event itself is in Italian, flanked above and below by two somber Hebrew quotations. The first is a quote from the Talmud, describing the martyrdom of Rabbi Hanania ben Trajan, who was burnt alive by the Romans while wrapped in a Torah scroll. The quotation reads, Gileon Nisrafim ve'osius perches. The parchment is burning, but the letters are flying, ascending, escaping. Meaning perhaps that even while the body burns, the soul, the thought, the ideas, the poetry lives on. The plot closes with a final quotation from a lamentation written by Reb Meir of Rodenburg, which he composed after watching wagonloads of Talmuds being burnt in Paris in 1242. Sadly, Rome 1553 was not the first nor the last time that the Talmud would be hunted down and burnt. The quotation reads, Sha'alei strufa be'esh, l'shalom evlaich, request, O those burnt by fire, for the peace of those who mourn you. The Inquisition tried crushing and burning both the spirit of the Jew as embodied by the Talmud, and the spirit of free inquiry, poetry, unity, and mysticism, as represented in this case by Bruno. But it is us who live on to tell the tale. We, fortunately, no longer live in a time where sharing the ideas and words that burn inside us will wind us up on a bonfire in a public square. So, dear seekers, speak your truth, because while the world burns, we need some people who are burning inside to speak their burning truth, to self-immolate with poetry, pathos, and compassion. I'd like to close with the words that the sagely scholar Adin Steinsaltz spoke at the commemoration of the burning and translation of the Talmud. He spoke thusly. Our sages say that before the Ten Commandments were written on stone, they existed in a different form, as black fire on white fire. Most think that that fire no longer exists, but it does. It finds itself between the pages, between the lines. It still is fire on fire, which gives us life. Against a fire of destruction, we must kindle a fire which welds and creates. It must be kindled in our hearts, not just upon the pages, so that it may burn in the hearts of thousands, 5,000, 15,000, 50,000, 5,000,000, to be set aflame. Because this is the fire with which we shall build a new world. Humanity is waiting to hear the words which burn within your heart, and may that fire give birth to a new world, a better world, a kinder world. Amen. If you're interested in figures like Bruno and others who blur the line between religion, science, philosophy, and mysticism, then you're in the right place. And I'd like to invite you to subscribe and join our community of seekers seeking unity together. As usual, I'll be posting all of my sources and recommended further readings down in the video description just here beneath the video. If you dig Bruno and want to get further into him, please do check it out and enjoy. And as always, keep seeking.